The deed hit the desk with a sound like a gunshot, and Inez Rourke watched Deputy David Granger's jaw go rigid. He did not look up at her right away. He kept his eyes on the paper, on the careful loops of ink that spelled out her supposed betrayal, and when he finally raised his face to hers, there was something in his expression that she had never seen there before. It was not anger. It was worse than anger. It was the slow, terrible recognition of a man who had been carrying a suspicion for a long time and had just found the proof. "I knew something was wrong the day this was filed," he said. The words landed on her like a branding iron. Inez stood on the other side of that desk in the Millhaven County Record's office, dust from the street still on her boots, her hands trembling at her sides though she would not let them curl into fists. Outside, through the smeared glass of the narrow window, the Utah Territory sun hammered down on the main street of Millhaven like God himself was angry at the town. She could hear the clang of the blacksmith's hammer. She could hear two men arguing outside the saloon. She could hear her own heartbeat, loud and shameful, because part of her had always known this moment was coming. "That deed is legal," she said. Her voice was steadier than her hands. "My father filed it in 1881. The Rourke claim on Copperhead Ridge has been in my family for 9 years. David Granger set the paper down flat on the desk and pressed 2 fingers against it, as though keeping it from escaping. He was 28 years old, lean and brown from working outdoors, with steady gray eyes and a habit of going very quiet when he was most serious. He had served as deputy under Sheriff Clarence Holt for 4 years, and in those 4 years Inez had watched him from a careful distance. She had watched him calm down drunken cowboys without drawing his gun. She had watched him ride 60 miles through a January blizzard to deliver medicine to a sick homesteader family. She had watched him and told herself firmly that he was none of her concern. Now his steady gray eyes were looking at her with something that felt like it might break her in two. "The notary seal on this document," he said, "belongs to a man named Archibald Phelps. Archibald Phelps died in March of 1880. The silence that followed was enormous. "That is a full year before your father supposedly filed this claim," David Granger continued, very quietly. "Someone used a dead man's seal to forge a land deed. And since your father passed away last spring and left this land to you, Inez, you are the one standing here holding a forged document, which means either you forged it or someone forged it and put it in your hands like a trap." She could not breathe. He leaned forward across the desk. "So I need you to tell me the truth. Right now. All of it." Inez Rourke looked at Deputy David Granger, at the serious set of his mouth and the careful flame of something that was not accusation in his eyes, and she made the decision that would change both of their lives forever. She pulled out the chair across from him, sat down, folded her hands on the desk, and began to tell him everything. To understand how Inez Rourke came to be sitting in a records office in Millhaven, Utah Territory, in the summer of 1889, watching a deputy read the document that could destroy her life, you had to go back 6 months. You had to go back to the raw February morning when she buried her father on the ridge that bore their name. Patrick Rourke had been a hard man in the way that the frontier made men hard. He had come west from County Clare in Ireland by way of New York and then Missouri, following the promise of land and independence, and he had found both on the eastern slope of Copperhead Ridge in 1873. He had built a house with his own hands, married a woman named Cora who died giving birth to their only child, and raised Inez alone on stories of the old country and the fierce stubborn conviction that what a man owned was what a man was. He had died of pneumonia in January of 1889, and Inez, who was 25 years old and the only heir to the Rourke homestead, had buried him beside her mother on the south-facing slope where the sage bloomed purple in May. She had believed the land was hers. She had believed the deed was sound. She had not known, in those first numb weeks of grief, that a man named Harlan Cross was watching her from the valley below. Harlan Cross was not a man who announced himself as a villain. That was the most dangerous thing about him. He was 53 years old, broad-shouldered, with a silver mustache and the kind of courtly manners that made women in church think well of him and men in business feel reassured. He owned the largest cattle operation in the county. He owned the feed store, part interest in the bank, and a great deal of goodwill from people who had never looked closely enough at how he had accumulated all of it. What Inez did not know, in February of 1889, was that Harlan Cross had been trying to acquire Copperhead Ridge for the better part of a decade. The ridge sat at the top of the only reliable water source in the eastern part of the county. The creek that ran through it fed 3 separate valleys below. Whoever controlled the ridge controlled the water, and whoever controlled the water in the Utah Territory in the summer controlled everything else. Patrick Rourke had known this. He had turned down Cross's offers, year after year, with a stubbornness that had infuriated Cross into eventually giving up asking politely. When Patrick Rourke died, Harlan Cross stopped being polite altogether. He had started with a visit. Inez had been sorting her father's papers in the house when Cross arrived with his hat in his hand, and his condolences rehearsed to a shine. He was sorry for her loss. Patrick had been a fine man. Surely a young woman alone on such a remote property would find the responsibility overwhelming. He was prepared to offer a generous price, one that would set her up comfortably in Millhaven or even Salt Lake City, far away from the isolation and hardship of the ridge. Inez had thanked him for his condolences and showed him the door. He had come back twice more in the following weeks, each time with a slightly higher number and a slightly less gentle undertone to his generosity. On the third visit, when she turned him down again, he had paused at the door and looked at her with an expression that she remembered now with a chill she could not entirely account for. "Miss Rourke," he had said, "I genuinely hope you understand the difficulties of holding a remote land claim without the proper documentation to support it." She had not understood what he meant. Not then. She understood now. Sitting across from Deputy David Granger in the county records office, Inez told him all of this in a steady voice, starting with the burial and ending with Cross's thinly veiled warning. She told him about the letter she had received 3 weeks ago from a man who described himself as a land agent, informing her that the deed to Copperhead Ridge was under dispute and that a competing claim had been filed by the Consolidated Range Corporation, which was, she had since discovered, a company with Harlan Cross's name on the founding documents. David listened to all of it without interrupting. He had a way of listening that made you feel genuinely heard, not just tolerated, and Inez found herself grateful for it even as she hated the circumstances that had made her dependent on it. When she finished, he was quiet for a moment. "The competing claim," he said. "What does it say?" Inez reached into the leather satchel she had brought and produced a second document, this one crisp and recently printed, bearing the seal of the Consolidated Range Corporation and claiming prior mineral rights to the Copperhead Ridge parcel dating back to 1879. David read it carefully. Then he looked at her deed again. Then he sat back in his chair and rubbed the back of his neck with one hand. "This is what I need you to understand," he said. "Both documents use the Phelps seal, which means both of them are potentially forged." Inez stared at him. "That means the original claim on the ridge might not exist at all. It means someone went to considerable trouble to make the legal history of that parcel very murky," David said. "And if I had to guess who benefits most from that murkiness, I'd say it's the man filing the competing claim, because in a dispute over a forged document, the person with the most money and the most lawyers generally wins." The cold clarity of it settled over Inez like snow. "Harlan Cross forged both deeds." "I can't prove that yet," David said. He held her gaze. "But I'm going to." She looked at him for a long moment across that narrow desk. There was morning light coming through the window behind him, catching the dust motes in the air, and she became aware, with an inconvenient and entirely unwanted sharpness, of how close they were sitting, and how the seriousness in his face was not coldness at all but something more like intensity, the concentrated attention of a man who took his promises seriously. "Why?" she asked. She had not meant to sound so blunt, but there it was. Why am I going to prove it? He seemed to consider the question genuinely. Because it's my job. Millhaven's deputy investigating a land fraud that the county clerk and probably half the courthouse is already aware of and has probably been paid to ignore, Inez said. That's not just your job, that's a risk. Something shifted in his expression, not quite a smile, more like the acknowledgement of a truth that he found clarifying rather than frightening. Yes, he said simply, it is. Inez looked away first. She rode back out to Copperhead Ridge that evening with the last of the light going amber and rose across the canyon walls, and she tried to untangle what she felt from what she knew. She knew she was in serious trouble. She knew the legal machinery that Harlan Cross had set in motion was designed to be overwhelming, to make her feel that resistance was futile and selling was sensible. She knew she was alone on this ridge with her father's cattle and her father's house, and a deed that might not be worth the paper it was printed on. What she felt was more complicated. She felt grief still, the kind that didn't announce itself but arrived quietly in the evenings when she lit the lamp and the house was too silent. She felt anger, the clean, useful kind, at Harlan Cross and his silver mustache and his courtly condolences. And she felt something else, something she had not expected, which was the strange warmth of having been looked at by David Granger and found neither guilty nor helpless. She watered her horse at the creek and watched the water running clear over the smooth stones, and told herself firmly that a man doing his job was not a reason to feel anything at all. 3 days later, David Granger rode up to Copperhead Ridge. He came in the afternoon, when the heat had peaked and was just beginning to soften, and Inez was mending a section of fence in the east pasture. She heard his horse on the track and turned, shading her eyes with one hand, and felt an irritating quickening in her chest that she attributed to the physical effort of fence mending and nothing else. He dismounted and tied his horse to the fence post and pushed his hat back with one finger. "I've been doing some digging," he said, without preamble. "I tracked down the original land survey records for this parcel. They go back to 1872. There's a federal survey notation for this particular section of the ridge that your father referenced in his first letter to the Territory Land Office in 1873. Inez set down her wire tool and gave him her full attention. "The survey notation is real," David said. "Your father was the first settler to formally claim this parcel under the Homestead Act, and there's a federal record of that, independent of the deed filed at the county level. That federal record cannot be forged by Harlan Cross because it's held in the Territorial Land Office in Salt Lake City, not in the Millhaven courthouse." She felt the breath go out of her all at once. "That's the real proof. It's a foundation," he said carefully. "It supports your claim and undermines his. But it doesn't prove who forged the county deed, and as long as Cross can argue that the county filing is invalid, he can tie this up in dispute long enough to either drain your resources or create enough uncertainty that a territorial judge rules in his favor. So I need to prove he forged it," Inez said. "We need to prove it," David said, and she noticed the pronoun and chose not to comment on it yet. He pulled a folded paper from his vest pocket and handed it to her. "I found something else. Archibald Phelps, the dead notary, had a clerk, a young man named Theodore Marsh who worked for him from 1878 until Phelps died in 1880. After Phelps died, Marsh went to work for Harlan Cross's cattle operation. He's been there ever since." Inez unfolded the paper. It was a copy of employment records from the county, Cross's name at the top, Marsh's below it, dated June of 1880. "You think Marsh kept the seal?" "I think Marsh had access to the seal, and I think someone who employed him afterward knew it," David said. "I want to talk to Marsh, but he won't talk to me while he's still under Cross's thumb. Which means I need a reason to separate them." "What kind of reason?" He met her eyes. There was a directness about him that she was beginning to recognize as characteristic, the way he would look at a thing without flinching from it. "Marsh has a sister in Durango," David said. "She's been trying to reach him for 6 months. I found her letters in the dead letter pile at the post office. Someone's been intercepting his mail. Inez absorbed this. Cross is keeping him isolated. And scared, David said. A scared man with a secret is the most dangerous kind of liability. If Cross decides Marsh knows too much and becomes a risk, things could go badly for Marsh. But if Marsh could be convinced that we can protect him in exchange for his testimony, he might talk. Inez handed the paper back. And you want me to go with you? He hesitated. I think Cross has people watching the roads. A deputy riding out to Cross's property alone would raise immediate alarm. Two people traveling, one of them a woman, one of them not in uniform, look less like official business. You want me to provide cover, she said. I want your help, he said. There was something different in his voice then, something a degree quieter and more honest. And I think you have a right to be part of this. It's your land. She studied him for a moment. The late afternoon light was warm across the canyon, and the sage smelled sharp and clean around them. All right, she said. When do we leave? They left before dawn the next morning. Inez had packed light, 2 days' worth of supplies in her saddle bags, her father's old repeating rifle in the scabbard, and the copy of the Federal Survey notation that David had given her tucked in the inside pocket of her coat. They rode south along the Ridge Road and then cut east across open country to avoid the main track, where David had confirmed, through quiet inquiry with a reliable source at the livery stable, that Cross had placed a man to watch for unusual traffic. The ride took them through country that Inez had known since childhood. Red rock formations rising like cathedral walls, juniper trees twisted by decades of wind, the wide dry basins where the light moved differently than anywhere else on Earth, slower and more deliberate, as if it had somewhere important to go and was taking its time getting there. She had not done much talking on the ridge. There had not been much occasion for it. After her father got sick, the isolation had closed around her gradually, and she had stopped noticing it the way you stopped noticing the sound of the creek after you had lived beside it long enough. David talked, not constantly, but in the natural way of a man comfortable with companionship, and she found herself responding more readily than she expected. He told her about coming to Millhaven 4 years ago from Kansas, where he had served briefly as a town marshal's assistant in a small community that had since dried up and blown away when the railroad bypassed it. He told her about Sheriff Holt, whom he respected despite the man's increasing tendency to look the other way when it involved Harlan Cross's interests. "Does Holt know what you're doing?" Inez asked. "No," David said without apology. "He'd stop me." She looked at him sideways. "That puts you at risk." "I know what I'm doing, Inez." It was the first time he had used her name without the formal prefix, and she noticed it the way you notice a change in weather, something in the air shifting before you can see the evidence of it. They arrived at the Cross property boundary by mid-morning. It was a vast operation, hundreds of acres of fenced cattle range, the main house visible from a distance as a cluster of dark shapes against the red earth. David had studied the layout in advance and knew that the foreman's quarters were separate from the main house, and that Cross himself was expected in Millhaven for a meeting at the courthouse that afternoon. Theodore Marsh's name appeared on Cross's payroll as a general accounts clerk, which meant he worked in the small office building beside the main barn rather than in the house itself. They tied their horses in a stand of cottonwood trees near the fence line and waited until a cluster of riders moved the opposite direction across the property, likely heading out to the northern pastures, before crossing the boundary on foot. The accounts office was a single-room wooden building, its door standing open against the heat. Inside, a thin young man of perhaps 30 was bent over a ledger book, writing. He had an anxious quality even at rest, a tension in his shoulders like a man perpetually bracing for a blow. David stepped through the door first. Theodore Marsh looked up and went the color of flour. "I'm not here to cause you trouble," David said immediately, keeping his voice low and steady. "I'm here because I think you're already in trouble and I think you know it." Marsh's eyes jumped from David to Inez and back. "You need to leave," he said. If Mr. Cross finds out you were here, Cross is in Millhaven, David said. He'll be there until at least 4 o'clock. We have time, and I need you to listen to me for 10 minutes and then you can decide what you want to do. He laid his case out quietly and methodically, the forged deeds, the dead notary's seal, Marsh's connection to Phelps's office, the letters from his sister that had been intercepted. That last detail was what broke something loose in Marsh's expression. He took my mail, Marsh said very quietly. Yes, David said. I thought she'd stopped writing. Something raw moved across the young man's face. I thought she didn't care anymore. She wrote to you every month, Inez said gently. Her name is Clara, and she works at a dry goods store in Durango, and she has been worried about you for 6 months. Marsh looked at her with an expression that was half gratitude and half terror. If I tell you what I know, I'm dead. You understand that. Cross is not a man who leaves loose ends. If you don't tell me what you know, David said, you're still at risk because at some point you will know too much for him to keep you around safely. The only way you get clear of this is to get clear of it completely. A long silence filled the small room. Outside, a crow called from somewhere near the barn. The seal, Marsh said at last. I kept it because I thought it might be worth something one day. I was 22 and stupid, and I didn't think about what it might be worth to the wrong person. He swallowed. Cross found out about it 2 years after I started working here. I don't know how. He just came to me one evening and told me he knew, and told me what he needed me to do, and told me what would happen if I didn't. He made you use the seal, Inez said. He told me exactly what to write, and I wrote it. Marsh looked at her with eyes full of something that might have been shame or might have been relief at finally saying it aloud. Both of them. Both deeds. His man brought me the documents and I pressed the seal and that was it. I told myself it was just paper, just ink. David laid his hands flat on the desk. I need you to write that down, and I need you to sign it, and I need you to come back to Millhaven with us and give that testimony to the territorial magistrate, not to Sheriff Holt, who I cannot vouch for. Can you do that? Marsh looked out the window at the vast red landscape of the Cross Ranch. Can you actually protect me? I'm going to try with everything I have, David said. I won't promise more than that. But I can tell you that once your testimony is in the hands of the territorial court, it becomes much more dangerous for Cross to harm you than to leave you alone. Another silence. Then Theodore Marsh picked up his pen. They rode hard. Marsh had a horse, and he knew to bring only what he could carry in one saddlebag. They were back across the fence line, and moving through the cottonwood trees before anyone in the main buildings had any cause to notice the account's office was empty. They took the southern route, the longer way, staying off the main roads, and Inez led them through a stretch of broken country she knew from childhood, a series of shallow canyons where the rock formations broke the sight lines and made tracking them on horseback difficult. She did not look at David during that ride. She focused on reading the land, on the angle of the shadows and the direction of the wind and the distant dust signatures that might or might not indicate riders on the flat. But she was aware of him with an attention that was more than practical. She was aware of the way he rode, easy and economical, the way he checked behind them at intervals without making it look like nervousness. She was aware of the conversation he had had with Marsh, the precise balance of honesty and reassurance, the way he had offered a risk calculation without pretending it away. She was aware that she trusted him, and that trusting a man was not something she had done easily or often. They reached Millhaven by late afternoon and went directly to the office of Judge Erasmus Webb, the territorial circuit magistrate who happened to be in town for the week to handle a separate matter. David had known he was there and had planned around it, and the forethought of that struck Inez again. The thoroughness of a man who had been quietly preparing for this moment for longer than she had known him. Judge Webb was a spare, gray-haired man of 60 with sharp eyes, and a reputation for impartiality that was genuine rather than performed. He received them in his temporary office at the back of the hotel and read Marsh's written testimony with the focused attention of a man who read documents for a living. "This is a serious allegation," he said when he finished. "Yes, Your Honor," David said. "The man named in this testimony has considerable standing in this county," Webb said. "His legal representatives will challenge this document's authenticity and Mr. Marsh's character. Are you prepared for that? We also have the federal survey records from Salt Lake City that establish the original Rourke claim independent of the county filing," David said, and placed the copy of the notation on Webb's desk. "And I have reason to believe there may be additional forged documents related to Cross's other land acquisitions over the past 10 years that could establish a pattern. I'm requesting a temporary injunction preventing the Consolidated Range Corporation from any further action regarding Copperhead Ridge while the matter is fully investigated." Webb studied the federal notation. He looked at Marsh, who had not fainted, which Inez considered a point in his favor. He looked at Inez. "Miss Rourke," he said, "this is your land." "Yes, Your Honor," she said, "and I intend to keep it." Something like approval crossed the old judge's face. "I will grant the injunction," he said. "And I will be contacting the Territorial Attorney General's office regarding a full investigation. Deputy Granger, you have taken a significant professional risk in bringing this matter to me rather than your superior officer." "I'm aware of that," David said. "I hope you're also aware that it was the right thing to do," Judge Webb said, and signed the injunction. The moment they stepped out of the hotel into the golden evening light of Millhaven's Main Street, David stopped walking. He stood on the boardwalk and released a breath that was not quite a sigh but was close to it. And when he looked at her, there was something open in his face that she had not seen there before. "We did it," he said. Inez looked at him. She was aware of Marsh standing a few feet away, still slightly bewildered by his own decision and the speed with which it had carried him here. She was aware of the town around them, the smoke from chimneys and the sound of the general store being closed up for the evening and somewhere a piano starting up in the saloon. "We did," she agreed. He smiled then, a real smile, and it changed his face entirely. She had seen him serious and focused and determined and cautious, but this was different. This was unguarded, and the effect of it was enough to make her look away toward the end of the street where the canyon walls caught the last of the sunlight. "I should get Marsh settled somewhere safe for the night," David said. "And I should get home," Inez said. Neither of them moved for a moment. "It's too late to ride back tonight," David said. "The canyon road is dangerous in the dark. You should stay at the boarding house. Mrs. Alcott runs a clean establishment and she won't charge you more than 50 cents for supper and a room." It was a practical suggestion. It was entirely sensible. Inez agreed to it and told herself that the warmth she felt was simply the relief of having done something meaningful after months of grinding grief and uncertainty. The next morning, everything changed. Harlan Cross had returned from his courthouse, meeting to find his accounts office empty and his clerk gone. He was not a man who panicked, but he was a man who acted swiftly, and by the following morning he was in Sheriff Holt's office before sunrise, and by mid-morning the county had issued a warrant for Theodore Marsh on a charge of stealing accounting records. It was a fabricated charge, thin and transparent, but in a frontier county where Cross had considerable influence, thin and transparent was sometimes enough to cause delay. David met the news in the corridor of the hotel where he had been speaking with Judge Webb again, and his expression hardened in a way that Inez was coming to read as the external sign of an internal decision being made. "He knows what Marsh testified," David said. "He's trying to discredit him before the territorial investigation gets traction." "Can he succeed?" Inez asked. "Not if we move faster than he does," David said. "I need to get Marsh out of this county and into the hands of the Territorial Attorney General's people in Salt Lake City. Today. The warrant means Holt will be looking for him," Inez said. "Which means someone needs to occupy Holt's attention while I get Marsh on the northbound stage," David said. He looked at her with that directness that she had stopped trying to prepare herself for. "I'm not going to ask you to do anything dangerous." "Then you'd better not ask me to do anything useful," she said, and watched his expression shift from determined to something very close to amused. She went to Sheriff Holt's office. It was not something she had planned in detail, which meant she was operating on instinct and nerve, which had gotten her this far and would have to be sufficient. Holt was a large, slow-moving man in his 50s with a walrus mustache and the air of a man who had decided some years ago that life was easier if you didn't look too closely at things. He was not a corrupt man in the ordinary sense. He was simply a man who had made a practical arrangement with power and called it pragmatism. Inez walked into his office and said, with every appearance of controlled urgency, that she had information about where Theodore Marsh had been hiding and needed to tell the sheriff personally, but that she required his assurance that Marsh would not be turned over to Cross's people before she disclosed it. It was enough to make Holt cautious and to make him want to hear more and to keep him in his office for the better part of 45 minutes while he asked questions she answered evasively but plausibly. When she emerged back onto the main street, the northbound stage had been gone for 20 minutes. She allowed herself one private moment of satisfaction before walking to the records office to wait for David. He arrived an hour later on foot, having left his horse at the stage stop. He came through the door of the records office and found her sitting in the chair where she had sat 3 days ago, and he looked at her with an expression that did almost precisely what she had feared and hoped it would. "You kept him talking for 45 minutes, he said. "I was persuasive," she said. "You were remarkable," he said, and meant it so plainly that there was no graceful way for her to deflect it. The silence between them had a different quality now. Not the silence of two people trying to maintain professional distance, but the silence of two people who had just done something difficult together and were sitting with the aftermath of it. "The investigation will take time," David said at last. "Cross will fight this. He has lawyers and he has money and he has the county clerk in his pocket. It could be months." "I know," Inez said. "You'll need to stay on the ridge and maintain your presence on the property," he said. "If you abandon it for any length of time, he'll use that as additional argument for abandonment of claim." "I'm not leaving my father's land," she said. "I know you're not." He sat down across from her, the same position as their first conversation, and for a moment neither of them spoke, and the sunlight from the window laid a stripe of warmth across the desk between them. "I want to continue to help you through whatever comes next, and I think it's right that you know that's not purely professional." Inez looked at him steadily. "What is it then?" He met her gaze and held it. "I think you know what it is." She did. She had known it since the ridge the previous day, since the smile on the boardwalk, since the 50 ways he had looked at her that added up to something that had no business name. She had known it and been deliberately, carefully not acknowledging it, because acknowledgement required a response, and a response required a decision. And she had made enough hard decisions recently to be cautious about adding one more. But he had said it aloud or near enough, and there was something about his honesty that made dishonesty feel small. "I've been alone on that ridge for 6 months, she said, "and before that I was focused on my father's care, and before that I was focused on learning to run the property, and I have not been in the habit of thinking much about anything else." "You don't have to think about anything else right now," he said. "I'm not in a hurry." She looked at him for a long moment. "That's a strange thing to say." "I mean it as reassurance," he said. "I'm not trying to add to your difficulties. I'm saying that whatever this is, it doesn't have to be decided today. But I'm not going to pretend it isn't there." The directness of it again, that refusal to make anything more complicated than it was or less honest than it needed to be. "All right," she said quietly. "Neither will I. The investigation took 4 months." They were 4 months of paperwork and depositions and legal correspondence between Millhaven and Salt Lake City, of Harlan Cross's lawyers filing challenges, and the Territorial Attorney General's office filing counterarguments, of Inez riding back and forth to town more often than she had in the previous 2 years, of Theodore Marsh giving his testimony in Salt Lake City under the protection of territorial marshals, while his sister Clara traveled up from Durango to be with him. They were also 4 months of David Granger riding out to Copperhead Ridge at least once a week, sometimes with news and sometimes without a specific reason that either of them named openly. He helped her repair the barn roof after an August storm brought part of it down. He helped her move the cattle to the south pasture when the creek ran high in September. He arrived one evening to find her sitting on the porch in the dark, because the grief had come in quietly with the dusk, and he sat beside her in the other chair, and did not ask questions, and did not try to fix anything. And that silence was one of the most generous gifts anyone had ever given her. He told her about his family in Kansas, a mother he sent money to when he had it and letters when he didn't. 2 brothers who had both gone further west, one to Oregon and one to California, chasing the same horizon their father had described on his deathbed. He told her about the early years of his deputyship, the things he had seen that had narrowed his sense of what people were capable of, and then the things he had seen that had widened it again. She told him about her father, the real version, not the simplified eulogy version. The stubbornness that had driven her half mad and saved them both multiple times. The way he had read to her at night when she was small, long rambling passages from whatever book he had managed to acquire, his Irish accent thickening when he was tired. The pride she had seen in his face the first time she managed the property alone during a spring that had kept him bedridden for 3 weeks. "He would have liked you," she said one afternoon, sitting on the fence rail of the east pasture while he repaired the section she had been working on the day they met. David looked up at her. "I hope so. He respected honesty above everything," she said. "He had no patience for performance, and he would have seen through yours very quickly if you had any." Did he see through Harlan Cross? She was quiet for a moment. He thought Cross was a man who had grown too large for his own good. He said there was a kind of greed that started as ambition and ended as something without a conscience. He said you could tell because it stopped being about what the man wanted and became about what the man couldn't allow others to have. David set down his wire tool. "That's a careful analysis." "My father was a careful man when it mattered," she said. "Loud and stubborn otherwise, but careful when it mattered." He was looking at her in a way that made the afternoon feel very still. "Inez," he said. "Don't," she said, but she was smiling. "I haven't said anything yet. You were about to say something that requires me to figure out how I feel about it." He laughed then, a real laugh, and she had not heard him laugh before, not like that, open and whole, and the effect of it was to make her feel something warm and complicated, and no longer something she could call by any name except what it was. "I've been patient," he said. "You have," she agreed. "I would like, at some point, when you're ready, and when the legal situation permits you to think about something other than land deeds and forged seals, to properly court you," he said. "In whatever manner you prefer. I'll follow your lead." She looked at the wide landscape around them, the red canyon walls and the sage-dotted basins and the creek catching the afternoon light below. She looked at this man who had believed her when believing her was difficult, and had acted when acting was dangerous, and had been consistently, unhurriedly honest in a way that was rarer than gold in the Utah Territory. "I'm ready now," she said. The Territorial Attorney General's office issued its findings in October of 1889. The investigation had uncovered not only the 2 forged deeds related to Copperhead Ridge, but also evidence of 4 other fraudulent land transactions over the preceding decade, all traceable through the use of Archibald Phelps's stolen notary seal, and all benefiting Harlan Cross or entities connected to him. Theodore Marsh's testimony, corroborated by handwriting analysis and the discovery of the original seal itself, in a locked box in Cross's private study following a search warrant obtained by the territorial marshals, was deemed credible and material. Harlan Cross was indicted on charges of land fraud, conspiracy to commit fraud, and obstruction of justice. The Consolidated Range Corporation's competing claim on Copperhead Ridge was voided. Inez Rourke received formal confirmation that her father's original homestead claim, supported by the federal survey record and validated by the territorial court, was legally and unambiguously hers. She was sitting at her kitchen table when the official letter arrived, delivered by a territorial courier who had ridden out from Millhaven. She read it twice. Then she set it down on the table and put her hands flat on either side of it and breathed carefully and steadily for a minute, until the particular kind of relief that is indistinguishable from grief had passed through her and out. She went outside and stood on the porch of her father's house, her house now, and looked out over the ridge that had been in her family for 16 years and would remain in it for whatever came next, and she thought about all the ways things could have gone differently, and then deliberately stopped thinking about them, because they had not. An hour later, she heard a horse on the track. David came around the curve of the road, and she was still standing on the porch when he rode up, and he took one look at her face and understood. He dismounted and tied his horse and came up the porch steps and stopped in front of her. "It's yours," he said. "It's mine," she agreed. He reached out and took her hand, which was the first time he had done that, a deliberate and careful touch, his fingers closing gently around hers, and she did not pull away. "I have some news of my own," he said. She looked at him. "Judge Webb recommended me for a promotion," he said. "The territory is creating a new investigative position, working under the Attorney General's office on land fraud cases. It would mean working across the territory rather than staying in Millhaven." She studied his face. "That sounds like something you'd be good at." "It's something I think needs doing," he said. "There are other Harlan Crosses out there. Other people sitting on land their families built who are being circled by men with more money and less scruple." He paused. "But it also means decisions about where to be based and where to operate from." "Why are you telling me this as if it requires something from me?" she asked, though she knew why. "Because it does," he said quietly. "Because I meant what I said in September, and I still mean it, and decisions like that don't get made as if other people don't exist." She looked at their joined hands for a moment. She looked up at him. "Copperhead Ridge is 12 miles from Millhaven," she said, "and Millhaven has a stage connection north to Salt Lake City. And the territorial investigator's position presumably doesn't require you to be in any one place all of the time." She tilted her head slightly. "Does it?" "No," he said very carefully. "It would not require that." "Then the geography seems manageable," she said. His grip on her hand tightened slightly. "Inez." "David," she said, and the smile she had been holding back arrived completely. He kissed her on the porch of her father's house in the October light with the canyon spread below them, and the creek running clear over the stones, and the sage putting its sharp green smell into the afternoon air. And it was the kind of kiss that was a beginning rather than a conclusion, unhurried and certain, and accompanied by the sense that the world had arrived at the place it had been moving toward for some time. He pulled back and looked at her, and she thought she would remember that look for the rest of her life. Not dramatic or theatrical, but real. The face of a man who had done something hard and right and was holding the result of it carefully, knowing it was worth holding carefully. "I should tell you," he said, "that I am entirely serious about this." "I know," she said. "So am I." The winter of 1889 in the Utah Territory was cold and long, and Inez found for the first time in years that she did not mind it. David rode out to the ridge when the weather permitted, and when it did not, she sometimes made the ride into town, staying at Mrs. Alcott's boarding house and spending the evenings in the common room where he would come after his shift, and they would sit across from each other at the table nearest the fire and talk in the way of people who have discovered, to their considerable satisfaction, that they will not run out of things to say to each other. He had formally accepted the territorial investigator's position in November, and the transition from deputy to investigator was to take effect at the start of 1890. He was negotiating the terms of his operational base, and Millhaven was, it turned out, a reasonable center point for the Eastern Territory. Sheriff Holt had been quietly replaced following the investigation's revelations about his accommodation of Cross's interests, and the new sheriff was a woman named Dorothea Fry, who had come up from Arizona, and had a reputation that made men with crooked intentions decide to try their luck somewhere else. Theodore Marsh was given immunity in exchange for his cooperation and relocated to Durango, where he was reunited with his sister Clara and found work at a newspaper. His careful clerk's hand and his intimate knowledge of how fraudulent land schemes were structured making him, unexpectedly, an excellent journalist. Harlan Cross stood trial in Salt Lake City in January of 1890 and was convicted on all counts. He was sentenced to 8 years in the territorial prison, and the properties obtained through fraudulent means were ordered returned to their original claimants or their heirs. Several of those claimants had already lost their land and moved on, but the court set aside compensation payments from Cross's assets for them. Inez attended one day of the trial, not all of it, just enough to see the machinery of justice running in the right direction, and to watch Cross sit behind the defendant's table with his silver mustache and his courtly bearing and all of the power that had been concentrated in him slowly and irreversibly dissolved. She did not feel triumphant. She felt something quieter and more durable than triumph, which was the confirmation that things could be made right if someone was willing to do the work of making them right. She thought about that as she rode home on the stage, and she thought about her father, and she thought about David, who had been the one willing to do that work. They were married in April of 1890. It was a small ceremony, held in the Methodist Church in Millhaven, which was the only church in town, and which neither of them attended with particular regularity, but which the minister agreed to use for the occasion without requiring too much justification. Mrs. Alcott came and brought flowers from her kitchen garden. Dorothea Fry attended in her capacity as the new sheriff, and also apparently as someone who had developed a genuine fondness for both parties. The county records clerk, who had replaced his predecessor following the investigation, attended because David had been consistently respectful to him, and he had responded with loyalty. Theodore Marsh sent a letter from Durango, addressed to them both, which arrived the morning of the wedding and which Inez read aloud at the breakfast table while David was shaving, and which made him pause mid-stroke and clear his throat. It said, among other things, that if he had known when he pressed a dead man's seal to a piece of paper that it would lead, through such an unlikely series of events, to something like this, he might have found a way to feel less guilty about it. The minister, whose name was Elias Bright, and who had been doing this for 30 years, performed the ceremony with the quiet expertise of a man who knew that what made it real had nothing to do with him, and everything to do with the two people standing in front of the altar. He noticed, as ministers did, the way they looked at each other when they said the words. He had learned to recognize the difference between the people who were performing commitment and the people who had already arrived at it and were simply making it official. These two had already arrived. When the ceremony was done and the small gathering had dispersed and David and Inez were outside in the April light with the canyon walls pink and cream above the town, she looked at the ring on her hand and then at him. "Investigator Granger," she said, testing it. "Mrs. Granger," he said, and the pleasure in his voice was unguarded and genuine. "I think I'll keep Rourke as well," she said, "for the property. The Rourke claim has been on the records for 17 years and I'd like it to stay there." "Inez Rourke Granger," he said, "that sounds like someone who owns a ridge." "It sounds like someone who earned one," she said, and he took her hand the way he had on the porch in October, deliberate and careful, and they walked together back toward their future. They spent the first year of their marriage in what Inez would later describe as productive chaos. David's new position took him across the territory on a rotating basis, investigating land fraud complaints that came to the Attorney General's office from settlers and homesteaders who had discovered, usually too late, that they were dealing with the same kind of machinery that had been turned against the Rourke claim. He was good at the work. He had a reputation that spread through the territory with satisfying speed, the territorial investigator who actually investigated, who did not stop at the edge of where money and influence made things complicated. Inez ran the Copperhead Ridge operation with her father's stubbornness and her own considerable competence. She hired 2 hands in the spring, brothers named Will and Santos Medina, who had been trying to find steady work since their family's homestead in the next county had been lost to a banknote that Inez suspected had been part of a similar scheme. She paid them fairly and worked alongside them without standing on ceremony, and they repaid her with the particular loyalty of men who have not been taken advantage of and find the experience refreshing. David came home when he could, sometimes for 3 or 4 days at a stretch, sometimes for a full week when the territory's schedule permitted. They had established a system of letters that kept them connected during the longer absences, real letters, not brief practical notes, the kind of letters that constituted a record of 2 people paying careful attention to each other's lives. In the 2nd year of their marriage, in the spring of 1891, Inez was pregnant. She told David on a Tuesday evening when he had ridden in from a week in the Southern Territory and was eating supper at the kitchen table and telling her about a case in Beaver County that was going to require careful handling. She let him finish the summary before she said it quietly across the table. He stopped talking mid-sentence. "Are you certain?" he said. "Women generally are," she said. He came around the table and kissed her with a thoroughness that knocked her hair slightly sideways, and then stood back with his hands on her shoulders and looked at her with an expression that she would spend considerable time, in the years that followed, trying to find the right word for. It was somewhere between wonder and determination, the look of a man who has just understood something about what he wants to protect and is simultaneously overwhelmed by it and entirely ready for it. "I need to talk to the Attorney General," he said, "about reducing the travel." "You don't have to do that," she said. "I want to do that," he said. "There's a difference." Their son was born in November of 1891, delivered by Millhaven's doctor, a steady-handed woman named Frances Pryor who had come to the territory from Ohio, and who had no particular patience with the notion that frontier conditions precluded competent medical care. They named him Patrick, after Inez's father, with David's surname, and from the first hours of his life he was, in Dr. Pryor's professional assessment, entirely unreasonably loud for a person of his size. Inez sat in the quiet of the afternoon with her son in her arms and David beside her on the bed with his back against the headboard and his arm around her shoulders, and she thought about the February morning 16 months ago when she had buried her father in the cold and believed that what was left of her family was entirely and only herself. "My father would have been insufferable about this," she said. "In a good way. In the absolute best possible way," she said. "He would have held this baby every waking minute and talked to him in Irish and completely disrupted the household routine." "We can still name him Patrick," David said. "That's enough of a tribute." "It's exactly the right tribute," she said. David looked down at the baby with an expression that she had never seen on anyone's face before and understood immediately, the particular look of a parent encountering a child for the first time and realizing that the category of things they would do anything to protect has just permanently expanded. "Hello, Patrick," he said quietly. "I'm your father. I'm going to try very hard to be worthy of that." He was. The years that followed were not uncomplicated. Frontier life in the Utah Territory in the 1890s was not a comfortable existence by the standards of the cities to the east and the settled communities to the north, and Copperhead Ridge was more remote than most. There were seasons when the cattle did poorly and seasons when the creek ran low and seasons when the weather was unpredictable and punishing. There were political complications at the territorial level, as Utah moved toward statehood in 1896, and the legal landscape shifted around the investigative office that David worked within. There was a year when a late frost killed half the kitchen garden, and a summer when a fire swept through the eastern pasture, and cost them 2 weeks of backbreaking work to contain and repair. There was a night when David rode in from the south looking 10 years older than he had left, because a case he had been working on for months had turned in a direction that reminded him of the darkness in people that he tried not to let define his view of them. She sat with him on the porch that night the way he had sat with her in the dark 3 years before, offering silence and presence rather than solutions, and he reached over in the dark and took her hand. "I don't tell you often enough," he said. "Tell me what? How much this matters," he said. "Coming home, having this to come home to. You tell me," she said. "Maybe not in words every day, but you tell me." He was quiet for a while. Below them the creek was running in the dark, the sound of it constant and clean. "The work is important," he said. "I believe that. There are people across this territory who are in the same position you were in, and if I can make the difference that you can," she said. "You do, that's not in question. I just want you to know that I know the cost of it," he said. "The time away, the uncertainty." "I knew what I was agreeing to," she said. "I'm not patient by nature, but I know the difference between a man who is away because the work is real and a man who is away because he prefers to be." She could feel him looking at her in the dark. "I never prefer to be away," he said. "I know," she said. "So do the children." Patrick was 3 by then, and had recently been joined by a brother named Cormac, who had his mother's red-brown hair and his father's tendency toward concentrated silence, and who at 14 months was already demonstrating an opinion about most things that he expressed with considerable emphasis. They were sitting together on the porch discussing their respective personalities when David's expression softened into something that was its own kind of answer to the harder things he had been carrying. "Cormac is going to be a lawyer," he said. "God help anyone he argues against," Inez agreed. The 18th of January, 1896 was the day the Utah Territory officially became the state of Utah, and in Millhaven, they celebrated with a bonfire on the main street and a dance that lasted until midnight. David danced badly but willingly, and Inez, who had spent her childhood learning reels from her father and had the footwork to prove it, taught him a version of a traditional step that he adapted into something that was technically incorrect but enthusiastically executed, and they danced together in the firelight while Patrick, who was 4, slept on a horse blanket near the edge of the crowd, and Cormac sat in the arms of Sheriff Dorothea Fry and watched the fire with the serious contemplation of a person who had not yet decided whether joy was trustworthy. Inez looked at David in the firelight, his face flushed and his hat knocked sideways and his eyes bright, and felt something that was not a single emotion but the composite of several years' worth of them layered over each other like the strata of the canyon walls. Love and gratitude and amusement and the particular certainty of a person who has found where they are supposed to be and knows it. He saw her looking and grinned. "I know I'm terrible at this." "You're wonderful at this," she said. "You're lying through your teeth." "I'm lying through my teeth about the dancing," she agreed. "The rest is accurate." He pulled her closer, and they continued their technically incorrect but enthusiastic reel in the firelight, while Utah celebrated its statehood around them. Theodore Marsh published a series of articles in 1894 about land fraud in the Western Territories that were widely reprinted, and he sent Inez and David copies of each one. The articles named Harlan Cross's operation as a case study, with names changed except Cross's own, and contributed to a broader territorial conversation about property rights and the need for stronger legal protections for homesteaders. Cross, who had been released from prison in 1893 after serving 3.5 years of his sentence, found himself unable to re-establish his former standing and left the county sometime in the following year. No one in Millhaven particularly noted his departure. Marsh also wrote, in a personal letter to Inez in the spring of 1895, that he had met a woman named Alice who worked as a schoolteacher in Durango, and that Clara approved of her, and that he thought perhaps there was something to be said for the idea that the worst things that happened to a person could redirect them toward the better things they would not otherwise have found. Inez wrote back and said she had come to the same conclusion herself. In the summer of 1897, a woman named June Hollies arrived at Copperhead Ridge with 2 small children and a letter of introduction from the county land office, saying she had heard that Inez Rourke Granger understood something about disputed land claims and was known to help people navigate the system when the system needed navigating. Inez looked at June Hollies, who was 26 years old and tired in the particular way of someone who has been fighting too long and doubts they have enough left, and recognized something she had seen in her own mirror 6 years ago. She made coffee and sat down with the woman and listened to the whole story. When David came home that Friday evening, Inez met him at the porch with 2 cups of coffee and the details of June Hollies' situation, and the name of the man who was attempting to fraudulently claim the Hollies family's grazing rights in the next valley. He listened with his coffee cup in both hands and his eyes on her face. "You want me to investigate," he said. "I want you to know about it," she said. "What you do with it is your decision." He set down his cup. "Inez, you know I'm going to investigate." "I know," she said, "but I wanted to ask rather than assume." He looked at her with something in his eyes that was very warm and very certain. "I think that's one of the reasons I married you," he said. "Only one of them," she said. He reached out and brushed a strand of hair back from her face, a gesture so habitual and gentle that she thought sometimes it was the most intimate thing he did. "One of the 10 or 15 most important ones," he said. She laughed. June Hollies' case was resolved within 3 months, the land fraudster in question being a smaller and less well-connected version of Harlan Cross, who had not counted on a territorial investigator with experience and motivation. June kept her grazing rights and her children, who were 6 and 8 years old, and who developed a friendship with Patrick and Cormac that lasted for years. Inez began, informally and without official designation, to be a resource for homesteaders in the eastern county who were dealing with land disputes. She could not practice law and did not pretend to, but she had learned enough in the previous 6 years about the federal survey system and the territorial records and the specific forms required for various filings that she was useful, and usefulness was something she had never needed much convincing to embrace. David encouraged her. He brought her copies of relevant legal documents and explained the reasoning behind procedures she found opaque, and when she asked questions, he answered them as seriously as he would have answered a colleague's questions, which she noticed and did not take for granted. "You should have studied law," he told her one evening when she had successfully helped a family in the next county file the paperwork to counter a questionable mining claim on their pasture land. "Women don't study law," she said. "They should," he said. "Well," she said, "there's the new state for you. We'll see what Utah does with itself." The children grew the way children grew in the West, fast and practical, and with their own opinions forming early and expressing themselves often. Patrick turned 7 in the autumn of 1898 and had his father's gray eyes and his grandfather's stubbornness, and an inclination toward taking things apart to see how they worked that resulted in, at various points, a disassembled clock, a disassembled saddle, and a theoretical approach to the kitchen pump that the hands Will and Santos Medina had to quietly correct before it became a practical one. Cormac, at 6, had indeed demonstrated early interest in the structure of arguments. He had an objection to most decisions that were made without consulting him, and a vocabulary for expressing those objections that was startling in a child his age. The local schoolteacher, a patient man named Aldous Crane, reported that Cormac was the most consistently challenging student he had encountered, and also the most likely to be correct when he challenged something. "He's going to be a lawyer or a judge," David said. "He's going to be a problem first," Inez said. "He already is," David said fondly. A third child arrived in the spring of 1899, a daughter this time, red-haired like her mother and like her grandfather Patrick Rourke, who could not be there to see her and whose name lived on in her eldest brother. They named her Nora, which was a name from the old country that Inez's father had used for women he thought were made of solid material. Nora Granger proved from her first months to be exactly the person her name suggested. She was calm where her brothers were energetic, observant where they were demonstrative, and possessed of a focus that made David, when he held her in his first weeks, say quietly that he thought she was going to be the one who surprised them most. He was not wrong. By the end of the century, Copperhead Ridge was a properly established working ranch, not large but sound, with a reputation for fair dealing and good cattle, and a house that was fuller and louder than the one Patrick Rourke had built by himself on an empty ridge in 1873. The house had been expanded twice, once with an additional bedroom, and once with a proper covered porch on the east side where you could sit in the mornings and watch the light come into the canyon. Inez sometimes sat there in the early morning before the household woke, with her coffee and the quiet, and thought about the day she had walked into the county record's office with her father's deed in her hand and her heart in her throat, certain she was about to lose everything her family had built. She thought about the sound of the document hitting the desk. She thought about David's voice. "I knew something was wrong the day this was filed." She thought about how that sentence, which had landed on her like a sentence of death, had turned out to be the beginning of something she had not known how to hope for. How the worst moment had contained already the person who would help her through it. There was a particular kind of gratitude that did not have a simple expression, one that lived in the body rather than the words, in the habitual rightness of a person's presence, in the way a home felt different when they were in it. She had come to know that gratitude well. She heard the door open behind her and felt the warmth of him before she heard him, the particular sound of his footsteps on the new floorboards. He set a second cup of coffee on the railing beside her and settled into the other chair. They sat together in the early October light of 1900, the first year of a new century, with the canyon below them and the creek running clear and the sage putting its sharp green smell into the morning air. "Patrick's going to want to ride out to the south pasture today," David said. "He mentioned it twice at supper, and once while I was trying to go to sleep." "He's been mentioning it since Tuesday," Inez said. "I told him I'd take him," David said, "if you can manage without me for the morning." "I have managed without you for much longer stretches," she said. "And I've been grateful every time you were still here when I came back," he said. She looked at him. The gray in his hair had started just at the temples, and she thought it suited him. She thought most things suited him, which was a conclusion she had reached gradually and now held without particular self-consciousness. "This land," she said. "I keep thinking about what my father said, that what a man owned was what a man was." "He meant it as strength," David said. "He did. But I think he was partly wrong," she said. "What we own is part of it, but what we build, what we protect, what we choose to stand up for," she looked at him steadily. "Who we trust, that's more of what we are." He looked at her for a long moment in the morning light. "Patrick Rourke was a wise man," he said. "He was," she said. "And you would have made him revise his thinking, which is the highest compliment I can give you, because he almost never revised his thinking." David reached over and took her hand on the railing, lacing his fingers through hers, and they sat together watching the morning arrive over the canyon in all its red and gold and ordinary beauty. Inside the house, she could hear Cormac beginning to argue with someone, likely the morning itself, and Nora's clear small voice saying something in response, and the sound of Patrick moving purposefully toward the kitchen with the single-mindedness of a boy with a plan involving horses and a south pasture. The house was full of the noise of people she loved. The land was hers, cleanly and fully and on the record. The man beside her was the person who had helped make both of those things possible and who had then, quietly and steadily and without drama, become the center of everything else. She tightened her hand around his. He tightened his around hers in return. Below them, the creek ran on. The sage smelled sharp and green and real. The canyon held the light the way it always had, slow and deliberate, as if it had somewhere important to go and was taking its time getting there. And Inez Rourke Granger sat on the porch of her father's house, which was her house, on the ridge that bore her family's name, with the man she had chosen and the children they had made and the life they had built together out of a forged deed and a deputy's honesty, and the stubborn conviction that what was right could be made to hold, and she thought that she had no complaints at all. Not one. Not a single one in all the wide, red, beautiful world.